Hi, and welcome to AQ's Blog and Grill. We're happy to have Glen Drummond revisit us here at the grill. Why do marketers keep talking?
Yeah, or why do they keep talking to themselves?
Yeah.
So it's a great question, and it's a fuzzy problem. There's no simple, clear answer. But here's a way to think about it. Back in Dublin, in the Dark Ages, there was a community that lived behind a walled community. This wall was made out of wooden stakes, and they were sharpened at the end. You know, the word impaled comes from these sharpened stakes. And we also have an expression in the English language called beyond the pale. And it was the group inside this wall that looked out at the people, inhabiting the wilderness surrounding, and considered them savages. Now, it's kind of a delicious irony that the people inside that wall, and this is in Dublin, Ireland, were Vikings. Within every industry, you have an ideology. And, an ideology consists of, ways of framing things, categories, terms through which we understand the world, ways of organizing things, assumptions that are taken in an unexamined way. And what is also kind of evident is that, not all consumers sign up for the industry's ideology.
Right.
Great companies fail by listening to their customers. They listen to their favorite customers.
Right.
And they are a little bit reluctant to listen to those customers who are beyond the pale, the savages, the non-customers, the people who don't take the same orientation to the way they frame things, the way they categorize things. They may be seen as being of less economic significance. So, Clay Christensen talks about the innovator's dilemma, and he observes the pattern repeated industry over industry where current non-consumers become the vector for the adoption of a new technology.
Right.
But I would observe that Christensen's innovator's dilemma is an instance of a broader pattern, that it's not just new disruptive technology, but it's in those margins of an industry where business model innovation comes, where changes in customer experience arrive. And yet, here we have all these industries in lockstep.
Right. Do you think that the innovation is being held back by the organizational framework, or is it that the customer base just doesn't seem ready enough yet?
Organizational structure and culture reinforces a set of behaviors that are intended to defend the interests of the organization by insisting on proof before innovation can take place. And that becomes a limiting factor. But I think there's something else that is actually really important, and that is to go back a step further and really examine cognition, really examine the way we're framing the world. Categories are a product of our imagination. And that is such a fundamental observation when it comes to marketing segmentation. Because if we recognize that categories are a work of imagination on our part, not an observation of a naturally occurring phenomenon, then the amount of strategic leverage that we can get out of making smart segmentation choices is really powerful. And if we actually recognize that sometimes even the core generic benefits that are claimed by an industry or a brand or market, inside that pale, inside that fence, are seen as, de facto good. But as you move further from the fence line, you have customers who have greater and greater tension with those ideas.
Right.
So it might be, think about Charles Schwab and the revolution they brought in trading stocks. What they did was they devalued the idea of advice.
Right.
And they shook the industry. Dramatically shook that industry. Now, do you suppose that could have happened if there weren't people who had a significant tension with the idea of advice in that marketplace?
Right.
There was a whole market that got unleashed. People who were current non-customers, because advice was being imposed in the business model, and it was being perceived as, of course you need all this advice. Right. And Charles Schwab completely blew that up. So there was an example where somebody who marketed beyond the pale, by attacking the central benefit of that category. That's not a one-off.
Right.
We can actually find this kind of pattern at play in a lot of different industries. And if we start to think that marketing segmentation is a system of categorization that's driven by imagination. We can use our imagination to find a system that actually makes sense strategically to give us an actionable framework for innovation, for brand positioning, for new products, for customer experiences that differentiate and engage with people who might not be currently inside that fence.
Right.
Then this strikes me as a path forward that can be really powerful. There are two really interesting ideas that are floating around that are, they might be precursors to what's called neuromarketing. They sort of tap into anthropology and cognitive science and so on. So one is Gerald Zaltman and his idea about the deep metaphors. So his observation is that we can't really engage with customers if we don't know the deep metaphor through which they're framing an experience, product, or a category. But that's an interesting idea that absolutely says, it's about the consumer. It's about the way the consumer sees the world.
Right.
Now, there's another body of thinking dealing with branding around, it's often talked about in terms of cult branding that says people make sense of reality in a narrative imagination. And so if you can leverage archetypes, the kinds of archetypes that we find through literature and history and drama and
storytelling.
Yeah. If we can activate the archetypes that are particularly relevant to our brand and our strategic advantages, legacy, and so on, then we have a generative model for brand consistency. Because when brand consistency is reduced only to rules, not something that generates possibilities, new ideas, then you miss. So what was it about Steve Jobs at Apple? What was it about Richard Branson at Virgin? Well, these are generators. They're spinning up frameworks for brand consistency that are new, but still consistent with the brand. So this idea of a brand archetype and attaching that brand archetype, it's behavior that a marketer is following, but they're following it with a kind of a roadmap that looks a little more deeply at customers and thinks about the way they think and the way they frame experience and see the world. So there's a middle ground there somewhere. Some part of it is strategic action. Some part of it is, outside of the control of the marketer and requires a real appreciation for the fact that decision-making on the part of consumers originates in the unconscious. It originates in the emotions. And the rational conscious part of consumer behavior is late to the party.
All right. So how are those brand people going to connect or engage with the customer if they're not going to be talking at them?
The image that comes to my mind is that marketers should be creating storyboards that the customer animates.
Yeah.
Laying out kind of narrative possibilities that invite the customer to participate in a way that they can identify with. The storyboarding process can help us avoid the situation where you get to a certain point and then you feel disoriented in that buying journey, and you feel you need to back up and recalibrate and reconsider.
Right.
And that is it's unfortunate and unpleasant for the buyer, and it also creates a great deal of waste of resources on the part of the marketer. If we think about the most interesting man on earth ad campaign, it's really a footnote to that observation. But there's another level here. I think that there is reasonable evidence that people are interrogating brand choices in the context of crafting their own identity, getting in touch with their own Andy Warhol, their inner Andy Warhols, as it were, but constructing their personality, constructing their identity in part through the choices they make with their brands. And this is where I think the old structure of house of brands, starts to become a little bit more tenuous in information-saturated, internet-driven marketplace where consumers know what's going on, because you've got one house of brands that has both the Real Beauty campaign underway and the Axe body spray campaign going on. And the orientation to the objectification of women's bodies in these two different models is really quite different. both very skillfully executed
Absolutely.
campaigns. But from the standpoint of longer range brand engagement, where's that going to go?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Glenn, it's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
Okay.